The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet, save for the deliberate, arrogant clicking of Chloe's designer heels as she crossed her legs. She sat directly behind the defense table, wearing a triumphant, mocking smirk that practically screamed victory. Her lover, Richard, didn't even have the decency to look his wife of 15 years in the eye. They thought they had her completely cornered. They thought Clara was just a clueless, discarded housewife about to be escorted out of the courthouse with nothing but a pitiful alimony check and a broken heart. But as Chloe whispered a cruel joke into Richard's ear, they had absolutely no idea what was resting inside the unassuming manila folder beneath Clara's hands. To the outside world of Seattle's cutthroat tech industry, Richard Sterling was a self-made titan. He was the charismatic founder and CEO of Sterling Data Solutions, a cloud security firm that had recently secured a monumental valuation. Magazines praised his visionary leadership, his relentless drive, and his impeccable business instincts. But behind every self-made man is usually a woman who handed him the bricks. For Richard, that was Clara. Clara and Richard had met 15 years ago when they were both drowning in student debt. Back then, Richard had a brilliant idea, but zero capital and even less business acumen. It was Clara, an accountant with a razor-sharp mind for logistics, who had drafted his first business plan. It was Clara who sold her grandmother's antique jewelry to keep their electricity on when Richard's first prototype failed. She had spent the first 7 years of their marriage working grueling 60-hour weeks at a mid-level corporate firm just so Richard could afford to pay his developers. As Sterling Data Solutions grew from a cramped garage operation into a multi-million-dollar empire, Clara intentionally stepped back into the shadows. She transitioned into managing their private estate and philanthropic efforts, perfectly content to let her husband bask in the spotlight. She didn't need the magazine covers. She had the security of their partnership, or so she thought. The shift in Richard wasn't sudden. It was a slow, insidious erosion of his humility. The more money that poured into their joint accounts, the more Richard began to believe his own press. He started coming home later, smelling of expensive scotch and high-end steakhouses. He upgraded his wardrobe to bespoke suits and began criticizing Clara's preference for quiet evenings at home over flashy society galas. Then came Chloe Beaumont. Chloe was hired as the new Vice President of Public Relations for Sterling Data Solutions. At 29, she was a decade younger than Clara, sharp, ruthlessly ambitious, and stunning in a manufactured, intimidating way. From the moment Chloe orchestrated a high-profile interview for Richard with a major financial network, the dynamic shifted. Chloe didn't just manage Richard's public image, she fed his monumental ego. She looked at him like he was a god, something Clara, who remembered him crying over a broken hard drive in 2012, simply couldn't do. Clara first noticed the red flags during the company's annual winter retreat in Aspen. Richard and Chloe were always standing just a little too close, laughing at private jokes, their body language entirely closed off to the rest of the room. Clara had approached them with a tray of drinks, only to catch the tail end of a conversation. "She just doesn't understand the pressure you're under, Richard. You need someone who operates at your frequency," Chloe had murmured, her hand resting momentarily on his forearm. When Clara stepped forward, Chloe hadn't even flinched. She merely offered Clara a cool, condescending smile. "Clara, we were just talking about the Oakmont Capital merger. Boring business stuff. I'm sure you'd rather hear about the ski instructors." Richard hadn't defended his wife. He had simply looked away, adjusting his watch. Most women might have screamed, thrown a drink, or demanded a divorce right then and there. But Clara was an accountant by trade and a strategist by nature. She knew that reacting emotionally would only give Richard the upper hand. He would paint her as hysterical and paranoid. Instead, Clara smiled tightly, handed them their drinks, and retreated to their suite. Once there, she opened her laptop. If Richard was having an affair, she knew he would be sloppy with the details, but protective of the money. She logged into their joint wealth management portal. Everything looked normal on the surface. But Clara knew Richard's financial habits better than he did. She began auditing their personal expenses for the last 8 months. It took her 3 sleepless nights, but she found it. A discrepancy disguised as a recurring consulting fee paid to a firm called Crestview Holdings, LLC. Clara traced the LLC registry. It was a shell company, registered in Delaware. A few more hours of digging through public records and property deeds revealed that Crestview Holdings owned a $2 million penthouse in downtown Seattle. The exact penthouse Chloe Beaumont had been showing off on her supposedly private Instagram account. Clara sat in the dark of her sprawling living room, the glow of the laptop illuminating her tear-streaked face. Her husband wasn't just cheating on her, he was funneling marital assets to buy a luxury property for his mistress. The betrayal sliced through her chest like a physical blade. But as the sun began to rise over the Seattle skyline, the tears stopped. A cold, absolute resolve settled into her bones. Richard wanted to play a high-stakes game, but he had forgotten one crucial detail. Clara was the one who had taught him how to play. Over the next 4 months, Clara played the role of the oblivious, supportive wife with Oscar-worthy precision. She ironed Richard's shirts, packed his bags for emergency business trips to San Francisco, and smiled pleasantly at corporate dinners. Meanwhile, Richard grew bolder, blinded by his own hubris and Chloe's constant validation. He began bringing Chloe to events that were strictly for family and partners. The most agonizing moment came during the final gala before the Oakmont Capital Partners merger, a multi-billion-dollar private equity deal that would send Sterling Data Solutions' valuation into the stratosphere. The gala was held at a lavish downtown hotel. Clara had arrived wearing a stunning but understated navy gown. She had barely stepped into the ballroom when she saw them. Richard and Chloe were holding court near the ice sculpture. Chloe was draped in a backless crimson dress, her hand resting possessively on the small of Richard's back. When Clara approached, the surrounding executives awkwardly averted their eyes. Everyone in the room knew. Clara was the only one they thought was in the dark. "Clara!" Chloe purred loudly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I am so glad you made it. Richard told me you were dealing with a nasty migraine. I don't know how you handle all that free time at home. I'd go crazy. But I suppose keeping the house running is a full-time job in itself, isn't it?" Richard chuckled, a cruel, dismissive sound. "Clara likes her quiet life, Chloe. Not everyone is built for the fast lane." Clara kept her expression completely neutral, though her fingernails dug painfully into her velvet clutch. "Someone has to keep the foundation from crumbling while you're busy." "Networking," she said smoothly. Chloe's eyes narrowed slightly, but Richard was too self-absorbed to notice the underlying threat. He just patted Clara's shoulder condescendingly. "Enjoy the champagne, honey. Chloe and I need to schmooze the Oakmont reps." That night, Clara didn't sleep. She spent the entire night scanning every document in Richard's home office, backing up hard drives, and compiling a secondary ledger. She noticed a series of complex stock transfers. Richard was quietly moving massive blocks of his founder's shares into offshore trusts right before the Oakmont merger was finalized. He was intentionally deflating his net worth on paper. 3 weeks later, the other shoe dropped. It was a Tuesday evening. Clara was in the kitchen, casually sipping tea, when Richard walked in. He didn't offer a greeting. He looked unusually tense, pacing the marble floor before stopping to lean against the island counter. "We need to talk," he said coldly. "All right," Clara replied, setting her mug down. Richard pulled a thick manila envelope from his briefcase and slid it across the marble counter. "I'm filing for divorce, Clara. It's over. We've grown apart. I'm moving in a different direction, and frankly, you're not keeping up." Clara looked at the envelope, then up at her husband. The man she had starved with, the man she had built from nothing, was staring at her as if she were a defective piece of office equipment he was writing off. A different direction, Clara repeated softly. Does that direction have a penthouse downtown? Richard flinched, a flash of genuine panic crossing his eyes before his face hardened into a scowl. Don't be dramatic. My lawyers have drawn up a very generous settlement. You get to keep this house. I'll give you a lump sum of $2 million, and we walk away clean. It's more than fair for someone who hasn't worked a day in 10 years. Clara opened the envelope and skimmed the papers. $2 million. The company they built together was about to be valued at over $800 million. He was offering her pennies on the dollar, hiding behind the offshore trusts and the fake valuation of his current liquid assets. If you fight this, Richard warned, leaning in, my lawyers will tie you up in court for years. You'll drain whatever money you have left on legal fees, and I will make sure you walk away with nothing. Sign the papers, Clara. Take the dignity I'm offering you. Clara slowly closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. I'll have my attorney review it. Richard scoffed, grabbing his coat. Suit yourself, but you're making a massive mistake. As the front door slammed shut, Clara picked up her phone. She didn't call just any attorney. She called Sylvia Carmichael. Sylvia was a legend in the Pacific Northwest, a ruthless, brilliant family law attorney who specialized in dismantling high-net-worth individuals trying to hide assets. When Clara walked into Sylvia's mahogany-paneled office the next morning, she didn't just bring the divorce papers. She brought 2 encrypted hard drives, a massive binder of financial audits, and a timeline of the Oakmont merger. Sylvia, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s, adjusted her reading glasses and flipped through Clara's meticulous documentation. The room was silent for 10 long minutes. Finally, Sylvia looked up, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. Clara, Sylvia said, her voice a low purr of absolute lethal intent. Your husband thinks he is playing chess with a pigeon. He has no idea he just handed the board to a grandmaster, this Crestview Holdings shell company, and these offshore share transfers. It's textbook fraud, and he did it during a pending corporate merger. Can we prove it in court? Clara asked, her voice steady. Oh, we aren't just going to prove it, Sylvia said, closing the binder with a sharp snap. We are going to let him perjure himself on the stand. We are going to let his little mistress sit in the gallery and watch. And then, my dear, we are going to take the entire company. The trap was set. Richard thought the divorce was the end of Clara. He didn't realize it was just the beginning of her revenge. The conference room in Sylvia Carmichael's downtown law firm offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the Puget Sound, but the atmosphere inside was claustrophobic and thick with hostility. It was the morning of the primary deposition. Clara sat at the polished mahogany table, her posture perfect, a plain black notebook resting in front of her. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, armor for the psychological warfare she was about to endure. Across the table sat Richard. He looked bored. He was scrolling through emails on his phone, occasionally checking his Rolex, projecting an air of a man deeply inconvenienced by a minor administrative error. Beside him sat his high-priced divorce attorney, David Kensington, a man famous in Seattle for bullying spouses into accepting low-ball settlements. And then there was Chloe. She technically had no legal standing to be in the room, but Richard had insisted she attend as his emotional support and public relations advisor, a blatant power play meant to intimidate Clara. Chloe sat directly behind Richard, legs crossed, wearing a smirk that could curdle milk. She held a designer coffee cup and audibly sighed whenever Sylvia spoke, her eyes darting over Clara's modest outfit with naked contempt. Sylvia adjusted her glasses and clicked her pen. Mr. Sterling, let's go over your sworn financial disclosure. You state here that your total liquid assets and stock portfolio amount to roughly $12 million. Is that correct? Richard didn't even look up from his phone. Yes, it's all in the file. Mr. Sterling, Please answer for the court reporter, Kensington prompted smoothly, though his eyes warned Sylvia not to push. Yes, Richard snapped, sliding his phone face down. 12 million. My startup valuation is largely illiquid until the Oakmont Capital merger goes through. And even then, my founder's shares are locked. Understood, Sylvia said softly. She paced slowly behind Clara. And you have sworn, under penalty of perjury, that you hold no other bank accounts, offshore trusts, or shell corporations? I am the CEO of a tech company, Miss Carmichael, not a cartel boss, Richard chuckled condescendingly. Chloe let out a perfectly timed, breathy laugh from the back row. My finances are completely transparent. I offered Clara $2 million. That is nearly 20% of my actual net worth. Frankly, for a woman who hasn't contributed to the company's bottom line in over a decade, it is a lottery ticket. Clara's knuckles turned white under the table, but her face remained impassive. Sylvia didn't miss a beat. Let's talk about your company expenses. Are you familiar with an entity known as Crestview Holdings, LLC? Richard's posture stiffened by a fraction of an inch. A microscopic tell, but Clara saw it. Kensington frowned, looking down at his notes. What does a corporate vendor have to do with this divorce proceeding? The lawyer demanded. Just establishing the boundaries of Mr. Sterling's corporate spending versus personal assets, Sylvia replied mildly. Mr. Sterling? They provide consulting, Richard answered, his voice losing a bit of its arrogant timbre. Strategic market analysis. I see. And who is the primary beneficiary or owner of Crestview Holdings? Sylvia pressed. I have no idea, Richard lied flawlessly. I deal with hundreds of vendors. My finance team handles the invoices. Chloe, sensing the slight shift in tension, leaned forward and whispered something into Richard's ear. He nodded, regaining his composure. Look, we are wasting time. I have a board meeting at noon. Are we done here? Sylvia walked back to the table and closed her folder with a gentle tap. Almost. Just to be absolutely clear for the record, Mr. Sterling, you deny transferring any of your Class A founders' shares into the Aegis Trust in the Cayman Islands over the past 6 months. Kensington immediately slammed his hand on the table. Objection! This is a baseless fishing expedition. My client has provided comprehensive financial affidavits. You are throwing out buzzwords to drag this out. I am merely asking a question, Mr. Kensington, Sylvia countered, her voice dangerously calm. Mr. Sterling? Richard glared at Clara, his eyes filled with pure venom, before turning back to Sylvia. No, I have not transferred a single share anywhere. My disclosure is 100% accurate. I swear it. Thank you, Sylvia smiled. It was a terrifying smile. That will be all for today. As they packed up, Chloe made a point to brush past Clara's chair. You know, Clara, Chloe whispered, her voice dripping in faux sympathy, if you drag this out to trial, you're going to bankrupt yourself. Richard is just trying to be nice. You should take the money and move on to whatever it is women your age do when they retire. Clara finally looked Chloe dead in the eye. The younger woman's smugness faltered for just a second under the sheer, absolute ice in Clara's stare. I'll keep that in mind, Chloe, Clara said softly. Enjoy the penthouse. Chloe froze, her perfectly contoured face draining of colour. She looked back at Richard, who was already marching out the door, oblivious. Clara picked up her notebook and walked out, leaving the mistress standing alone in the suffocating silence of the conference room. 4 months later, the doors of the King County Superior Court swung open. The media had caught wind of the high-stakes divorce just weeks before the Oakmont merger was finalized. Financial reporters crowded the hallway, eager to see how a messy marital dispute might impact Sterling Data Solutions' looming billion-dollar valuation. Inside the courtroom, the air was practically humming with electricity. Chloe Beaumont had secured a seat in the very first row of the gallery, directly behind the defense table. She was flanked by 2 of her public relations associates, acting less like a woman at a divorce trial and more like a celebrity attending a fashion show. She wore a striking, stark white designer suit, a deliberate, psychological slap in the face to Clara, signaling who the real bride of Richard's future would be. As Clara walked down the aisle towards the plaintiff's table, Chloe openly leaned over to her friend, covered her mouth, and laughed silently. Clara ignored her. She took her seat next to Sylvia. Today, Clara wore a deep emerald green dress, her spine straight, her demeanor entirely composed. She had spent 15 years building a man up. She was fully prepared to spend today tearing him down to the studs. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench and a fierce reputation for detesting perjury, took his seat. "Let's proceed," his booming voice echoed through the wood-paneled room. "I understand we are bypassing a settlement and moving directly into arguments regarding asset division." "Yes, Your Honor," Kensington stood, buttoning his jacket. "We are here because the plaintiff, Mrs. Sterling, refuses to accept a highly equitable settlement. We intend to prove that her demands for half of Sterling Data Solutions are entirely baseless." Kensington's opening statement was a masterclass in character assassination. He painted Richard as a solitary genius, a modern-day Prometheus who brought the fire of cloud security to the tech world. Clara, on the other hand, was depicted as a relic of his past, a woman who had merely kept the couch warm while Richard built an empire. "Your Honor, Mrs. Sterling has not earned a paycheck in a decade," Kensington argued, pacing the floor. "She managed the household staff. She attended charity dinners. While my client was pulling 80-hour weeks, Mrs. Sterling was picking out drapery. We are offering her $2 million. It is enough to live out the rest of her life in absolute luxury. To demand 50% of a company she has zero operational knowledge of is not just greedy. It is extortion." In the gallery, Chloe nodded in emphatic agreement, casting a pitying look at the back of Clara's head. When it was Sylvia's turn, she didn't pace. She walked directly to the podium, placing a single thick binder on the wood. "Your Honor," Sylvia began, her voice crystal clear, "Mr. Kensington has told you a fascinating fairy tale about a solitary genius. But businesses, much like marriages, are rarely built in isolation, and they are certainly not destroyed in isolation. We are not here simply to divide a marital estate. We are here because the defendant has engaged in a systematic, fraudulent campaign to hide over $400 million in marital assets." A collective gasp echoed from the reporters in the back row. Richard bolted upright in his chair. Kensington immediately objected. "Overruled," Judge Caldwell growled, leaning forward over the bench. "Miss Carmichael, that is a staggering accusation. You better have the paper trail to back it up." "I have a highway, Your Honor," Sylvia replied flatly. The trial moved into witness testimony. Kensington called Richard to the stand first, allowing him to weave his narrative of hard work and self-sacrifice. Richard played the victim perfectly, sighing heavily as he described how distant Clara had become, how she didn't understand the pressures of his success. It was a near-verbatim repeat of the lines Chloe had fed him in Aspen. Then, it was Sylvia's turn to cross-examine. She approached the stand holding a stack of glossy photographs. "Mr. Sterling, you testified earlier that your liquid assets are severely tied up, correct? That you have had to be frugal in your personal spending to keep the company afloat?" "That is correct," Richard said confidently. "I see." Sylvia handed the photographs to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge, and then a set to Richard. "Could you tell the court what these pictures depict?" Richard looked down, and the color instantly drained from his face. Kensington craned his neck to see. It's a penthouse apartment," Richard stammered. "A luxury penthouse at the Avery Tower, purchased 8 months ago for $4 million in cash to be exact," Sylvia said, turning to face the gallery. "Purchased by a company called Crestview Holdings LLC. Mr. Sterling, You testified in your deposition that Crestview Holdings was a consulting vendor for your tech firm. Do your consultants usually live in $2 million apartments paid for by your corporate accounts? Objection! Relevance! Kensington shouted, scrambling to his feet. Goes directly to the concealment of marital funds, Your Honor, Sylvia fired back. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Sterling, Judge Caldwell commanded, his eyes narrowing. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. It was a corporate investment property for hosting clients. Hosting clients, Sylvia repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. Fascinating. She walked over to her table and picked up another document. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit G into evidence. This is the deed for the Avery Tower penthouse. It is indeed owned by Crestview Holdings, but if we look at the incorporation documents for Crestview Holdings filed in Delaware, we see the sole managing director is not an investment firm. Sylvia turned around, locking eyes directly with Chloe Beaumont in the front row. Chloe's smug smirk had entirely vanished, replaced by wide-eyed panic. The sole managing director, Sylvia's voice echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtroom, is Miss Chloe Beaumont, the Vice President of Public Relations for Sterling Data Solutions. The courtroom erupted into furious whispers. Reporters scribbled frantically. Judge Caldwell slammed his gavel down. Order! Order in this court! Kensington looked at his client in absolute shock. Richard, what is she talking about? He hissed under his breath. Richard just stared blankly ahead, his jaw clenched. Mr. Sterling, Sylvia continued relentlessly, stepping right up to the witness stand. Did you, or did you not, use marital funds, disguised as corporate expenses, to purchase a secret luxury home for your mistress, while simultaneously plotting to divorce your wife of 15 years? It wasn't a secret, Richard stammered, his polished CEO persona cracking violently. It was part of her compensation package, a retention bonus, a $2.4 million retention bonus for a PR director. Sylvia laughed aloud, an incredibly sharp, harsh sound. Your Honor, I would like to call our next witness, forensic accountant Philip Monroe, to explain exactly how Mr. Sterling funded this retention bonus. Because, as it turns out, the penthouse is just the spare change he dropped between the couch cushions. Wait until we show you what he did with the company shares. In the gallery, Chloe practically shrank into a seat, her white designer suit suddenly looking less like a bridal statement and more like a surrender flag. But Clara didn't look back at her. Clara kept her eyes locked on Richard, watching the empire he thought he solely owned begin to burn to the ground. The courtroom doors hissed shut, sealing the tension inside the wood-paneled walls. Philip Monroe, a veteran forensic accountant with wire-rimmed glasses and a resume that included unraveling Ponzi schemes for the SEC, took the witness stand. He carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to anchor a battleship. For Richard Sterling, it might as well have been filled with live explosives. Sylvia Carmichael approached the podium, projecting a large, intricate flowchart onto the courtroom monitors. The chart was a dizzying web of corporate entities, bank transfers, and offshore trust accounts. Mr. Monroe, Sylvia began, her voice echoing with crystalline authority, you were retained by my client to conduct an independent audit of the marital estate and Mr. Sterling's personal financial disclosures. Could you walk the court through your findings regarding an entity known as the Aegis Trust? Monroe adjusted his microphone, his demeanor entirely clinical. Certainly. Over the course of the last 6 months, coincidentally aligning with the preliminary negotiations of the Oakmont Capital merger, Mr. Sterling initiated a series of complex stock transfers. He moved approximately 450,000 Class A founders' shares out of his personal portfolio and into a holding company registered in Delaware. And where did those shares go from there? Sylvia asked, pacing slowly. They were subsequently funneled into the Aegis Trust, an irrevocable trust domiciled in the Cayman Islands, Monroe stated flatly. The beneficiary of this trust is not Richard Sterling on paper. It is a blind corporate entity. However, by tracing the IP addresses used to authorize these digital transfers, we found that 92% of the transaction authorizations originated from the secure Wi-Fi network at Mr. Sterling's primary residence in Seattle. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The financial reporters in the back row were practically vibrating, their laptops clicking furiously. "What is the estimated value of those transferred shares, Mr. Monroe, given the impending Oakmont merger?" Sylvia pressed. "Based on the preliminary term sheet signed by Oakmont Capital Partners, those specific shares carry a post-merger valuation of roughly $380 million, Monroe answered. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. $380 million. In the front row of the gallery, Chloe Beaumont's perfect posture completely collapsed. The color drained from her bronzed face so rapidly she looked physically ill. She turned to stare at Richard, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and sudden, dawning comprehension. She wasn't dating a brilliant billionaire who was giving his wife a fair severance. She was an accomplice to a man committing massive, federal-level financial fraud in broad daylight. David Kensington, Richard's attorney, practically leaped out of his chair. "Objection, Your Honor. This is entirely speculative. The Oakmont merger has not closed. Those valuations are theoretical paper money. Furthermore, placing assets into a trust is a standard legal tax optimization strategy for high-net-worth individuals anticipating a liquidity event." Judge Caldwell peered over his reading glasses, his expression dark and utterly unimpressed. "Mr. Kensington, you can dress up a pig in a tuxedo and call it tax optimization. But if the pig is hiding $380 million from a spouse during a divorce proceeding, it's still a pig. Objection overruled. Sit down." Kensington sank back into his chair, his face flushed. He leaned over to Richard and hissed, "You told me you didn't move the shares. You told me the Aegis Trust was a legacy vehicle from 5 years ago." Richard's jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched visibly. Sweat had broken out along his hairline. "I didn't think she could find it," he whispered back, his voice hoarse, entirely stripped of its usual arrogance. "It was encrypted." "You encrypted it on your home network." Kensington groaned, rubbing his temples in utter defeat. "Your wife is an accountant, you absolute fool." Sylvia wasn't finished. She walked back to a table and picked up a second folder. "Mr. Monroe, let's pivot back to Crestview Holding LLC. We have already established that this entity purchased a $2.4 million penthouse for Miss Chloe Beaumont. But did Crestview Holdings have any other interesting expenditures?" Monroe flipped open a ledger. "Yes, over the past 8 months, Crestview Holdings billed Sterling Data Solutions for roughly $600,000 in consulting fees. These funds were immediately diverted to pay for personal luxuries. We have receipts for a platinum diamond tennis bracelet, first-class flights to St. Bart's, a bespoke wardrobe from Milan, and a $200,000 down payment on a Porsche 911. Sylvia turned slowly, letting her gaze sweep over the courtroom before settling on Chloe. The mistress, who had mockingly asked Clara how she spent her free time at the gala, was now shrinking under the collective, glaring scrutiny of the entire courtroom. The white designer suit she wore, likely paid for by the very funds being discussed, suddenly felt like a fluorescent target painted on her back. "To summarize, Mr. Monroe," Sylvia said, leaning against the podium. "Mr. Sterling systematically drained marital funds to finance a lavish lifestyle for his mistress, while simultaneously hiding hundreds of millions of dollars offshore to ensure his wife of 15 years was left with a fractional, insulting settlement of $2 million. Is that an accurate assessment of the financial data?" "From a forensic accounting standpoint," Monroe nodded, "it is textbook asset dissipation and fraudulent concealment. Thank you, Mr. Monroe. No further questions." when it was Kensington's turn to cross-examine. It was a massacre. He tried to attack Monroe's methodology, but Monroe casually batted away every attempt with impenetrable walls of data, bank routing numbers, and digital signatures. Every question Kensington asked only served to dig Richard's grave a few feet deeper. Clara sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply watched the man she had loved, the man she had sacrificed her 20s to build up, unravel under the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. But as devastating as the forensic accountant's testimony was, it was only the appetizer. Clara knew the main course was yet to come. The afternoon sun filtered through the high, arched windows of the courtroom, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished wooden floors. The atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was electric. The Oakmont Capital merger, the mistresses, the offshore accounts, it had all painted a picture of grotesque corporate greed. But Judge Harrison Caldwell had been sitting on the bench for a long time. He had a sixth sense for when a puzzle was missing its centerpiece. Judge Caldwell held up a hand, silencing Kensington, as the defense attorney tried to stammer out another pointless objection regarding the admissibility of the St. Bart's flight records. "Mr. Kensington, enough," Judge Caldwell rumbled, his voice cutting through the room like a foghorn. He picked up a thick, yellowed document from the very bottom of the evidence pile Sylvia had submitted hours ago. He adjusted his glasses and spent 2 agonizingly long minutes reading it in absolute silence. The courtroom held its collective breath. You could hear a pin drop. Finally, the judge lowered the document and looked directly at Richard Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Caldwell began, his tone deceptively mild, "we have spent the last 4 hours discussing what you did with the shares of Sterling Data Solutions. We've discussed Cayman trusts, Delaware shell companies, and multi-million-dollar retention bonuses for public relations directors." Chloe flinched in the gallery at the mention of her title. "But I am a man who likes to start at the foundation of a house before I inspect the roof," the judge continued. He held up the yellowed document. "This is Exhibit A, the original Articles of Incorporation for Sterling Data Solutions, filed with the state of Washington 15 years ago. Do you recall this document?" Richard swallowed hard, a fresh bead of sweat tracing down his temple. "Yes, Your Honor. I filed it when I founded the company." "When you founded the company," the judge repeated, leaning forward. "Mr. Sterling, let's take a walk down memory lane. Starting a tech infrastructure company requires capital, servers, bandwidth, initial developer salaries. It is not cheap. When you incorporated this business, what was the exact source of your seed capital?" Richard gripped the edges of the witness stand. He looked at Kensington, but his lawyer was furiously flipping through his own notes, looking equally confused. I used personal savings, Your Honor, and some early angel investments." "Personal savings," Judge Caldwell mused, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. "That is fascinating under oath, Mr. Sterling, because according to the bank records attached to this original filing, you had exactly $412 in your checking account in the month of incorporation. Furthermore, you had a credit score of 520 due to defaulted student loans. Does that sound like a man who could secure commercial real estate and server leases?" Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked completely paralyzed. "Let me tell you what this document actually says," Judge Caldwell commanded, his voice rising in volume and authority, echoing off the mahogany walls. "It says that the initial seed capital of $45,000 came from a cashier's check, a check drawn from a sole proprietorship bank account belonging to Clara Sterling. Funds generated from the sale of inherited family assets." The judge paused, letting the weight of that statement crash down on Richard. But he wasn't done. "More importantly, Mr. Sterling, let's look at the equity distribution in this original 2009 filing. You seem to operate under the delusion that you own 100% of the voting shares of this company, giving you the right to unilaterally transfer them offshore. Judge Caldwell held the paper higher. But according to the Foundational Operating Agreement, an agreement that was never amended, never legally dissolved, and never superseded by any future corporate restructuring, 51% of the Class A voting shares of Sterling Data Solutions were assigned to a holding entity called C&R Ventures. Kensington's pen slipped from his hand, clattering loudly against the defense table. He slowly looked up at the judge, his face a mask of absolute horror. "And who is the sole registered managing director of C&R Ventures, Mr. Sterling?" the judge asked, his voice dripping with lethal precision. Richard looked like he was going to vomit. His eyes darted to Clara. She sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking back at him with the cold, immovable calm of a glacier. "I asked you a question, Mr. Sterling," the judge barked, slamming his gavel. "Who controls C&R Ventures?" "Clara," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "Clara controls it." Pandemonium erupted in the gallery. Reporters surged forward in their seats. Chloe Beaumont clamped a hand over her mouth, a muffled, horrified gasp escaping her lips. "Speak up for the court reporter," the judge demanded. "Clara!" Richard shouted, his composure shattering entirely. "Clara is the managing director." "Exactly," Judge Caldwell said, throwing the document back onto his desk in disgust. "Because 15 years ago, you couldn't get a bank loan to buy a used car, let alone fund a tech startup. Your wife funded the company. Your wife took on the financial liability. And your wife, legally, holds the controlling interest." The judge leaned over the bench, his eyes boring into Richard's soul. "You didn't just try to hide marital assets from your wife, Mr. Sterling. You illegally transferred shares that you did not possess the voting power to move. You committed corporate fraud, wire fraud, and perjury in my courtroom. You don't own the company you are trying to sell to Oakmont Capital. Clara Sterling does." The color completely washed out of the courtroom for Richard. The walls seemed to be closing in. He had spent 10 years believing his own myth, surrounding himself with sycophants like Chloe, who told him he was a solitary genius. He had entirely forgotten the messy, desperate early days when Clara had structured the company to protect them from his terrible credit. He had assumed that because he was the face of the company, the CEO on the magazine covers, he held the keys to the kingdom. He had forgotten that Clara was the architect who built the castle. "Your Honor," Sylvia Carmichael spoke up, her voice slicing cleanly through the chaos. "In light of this revelation, and the blatant, documented attempts to dissipate marital assets and defraud the plaintiff, we formally request that the court freeze all of Mr. Sterling's assets, revoke his executive authority over Sterling Data Solutions pending a full federal investigation, and grant full operational control of the Oakmont merger negotiations to the majority shareholder, Mrs. Clara Sterling." Judge Caldwell didn't even hesitate. Motion granted. Bailiff, secure Mr. Sterling's passports. We will reconvene tomorrow morning to discuss the immediate transfer of corporate governance and refer these fraudulent offshore transfers to the United States Attorney's Office. The gavel strike that ended the session didn't just echo through the wood-paneled courtroom. It sounded like a steel beam snapping under immense pressure, signaling the absolute, catastrophic destruction of Richard Sterling's carefully curated empire. As Judge Caldwell swept out of the room, his black robes billowing behind him, the gallery behind the barricade erupted into a localized hurricane of chaos. Financial reporters were literally shoving each other out of the way to reach the heavy oak doors, their thumbs flying across smartphone screens to break the story of the decade. Tech visionary exposed as fraud by wife who secretly owns his company. It was the kind of spectacular corporate implosion that would spawn documentaries and best-selling books. At the defense table, Richard was entirely paralyzed. He remained frozen in his heavy leather chair, his eyes wide and vacant, staring blankly at the intricate wood grain of the table. His bespoke charcoal suit, which had looked so sharp and authoritative that morning, now seemed to hang off him like a borrowed costume. Beside him, David Kensington, His high-priced bulldog of a lawyer was not offering any words of comfort. Instead, Kensington's face was an alarming shade of crimson as he frantically shoved his legal pads, laptops, and files into his monogrammed briefcase with violent, jerky movements. "David, wait!" Richard stammered, his hands shaking so violently he could barely press them flat against the table. "David, what do we do? We have to file an immediate appeal. We have to file a federal injunction to stop the asset freeze. If they freeze the Cayman accounts, the Oakmont merger is dead on arrival." Kensington zipped his briefcase shut with a sharp, aggressive yank and turned to look at Richard. The sheer, unadulterated disgust in the lawyer's eyes made Richard flinch. "Appeal what, Richard?" Kensington hissed, leaning in so the lingering press couldn't hear, his voice vibrating with rage. "You used me to present completely fabricated corporate disclosures to a sitting superior court judge. You lied to my face for 6 months. You committed felony wire fraud, perjury, and gross violations of SEC regulations, and you did it all to buy a luxury condo for a PR rep while trying to financially execute the woman who literally owns the paper your company is printed on." "I didn't think she kept the original 2009 filings," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate whine. "It was 15 years ago. It was a formality. It was a binding legal contract that proves you are a fraud," Kensington spat back. "I am an officer of the court, Richard. My reputation is everything in this city, and you just turned me into an unwitting accomplice to federal financial crimes. I am formally withdrawing as your counsel, effective the second I walk out those doors. You don't need a family law attorney anymore. You need the most expensive white-collar criminal defense team on the West Coast, and frankly, good luck paying their massive retainers with frozen assets. Do not call my office again." Kensington turned on his heel, pushed through the swinging wooden gate, and marched out of the courtroom without a backward glance, leaving the solitary genius entirely, suffocatingly alone. In the front row of the gallery, Chloe Beaumont was experiencing her own terrifying descent into reality. Her PR instincts, usually sharp, manipulative, and flawlessly calculated, were entirely short-circuiting. The lavish lifestyle, the first-class flights to St. Bart's, the VIP tables at exclusive clubs, it was all evaporating before her very eyes, replaced by the horrifying, looming spectre of federal subpoenas and criminal complicity charges. She stood up, her knees trembling so badly she had to grip the back of the wooden bench to steady herself. She adjusted her stark white designer jacket, attempting to slip out the side doors unnoticed while the press was distracted. But Clara was already waiting. Clara had calmly walked around the plaintiff's table and now stood squarely in the center aisle, a human roadblock between the mistress and her escape route. Sylvia Carmichael stood 3 paces behind her client, arms crossed, wearing the deeply satisfied expression of a predator watching a successful hunt conclude. Chloe stopped dead in her tracks. The arrogant, mocking smirk she had worn like armor for the past 8 months was completely gone. In its place was the wide-eyed, hyperventilating panic of a cornered animal. Up close, Clara could see the younger woman's heavy contour makeup beginning to run from the sweat beading on her forehead. "Clara, please, you have to listen to me," Chloe stammered, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "I didn't know about the offshore accounts. I swear to God. Richard manipulated me. He told me he was entirely self-made. He told me you were just holding him back, that you were entirely dependent on him." "I am sure he spun a very convincing narrative," Clara replied. Her voice was dangerously soft, yet it carried the immense, crushing weight of ultimate victory, and you were more than happy to swallow every word of it, just as long as the diamond tennis bracelets and the Porsche payments cleared the bank. I can give the penthouse back," Chloe whispered desperately, casting a terrified glance at the few reporters still lingering near the doors, their cameras raised. "I'll sign the deed over to you right now, today. You can have it all. Just please don't let them drag my name into the criminal investigation." Clara tilted her head slightly, inspecting the younger woman as if she were a defective product rolling down an assembly line. "You really don't understand how any of this works, do you, Chloe?" Clara asked, a trace of genuine pity cutting through the ice in her tone. "I don't want the penthouse. It is tainted property. Within the next 48 hours, the federal government is going to place a line on it, as it was purchased with fraudulently obtained corporate funds. You won't be signing the deed over to me. You will be handing the physical keys to the FBI. That Porsche 911, impounded. The Cartier jewelry, asset forfeiture." Chloe let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, taking a step backward. "I highly suggest you go home and start packing a very small, practical suitcase," Clara continued calmly. "I hear federal marshals do not give you much time to gather your designer bags when they arrive to execute a raid." Chloe let out a broken, entirely undignified sob. She shoved past Clara, burying her face in her hands to hide her ruined makeup, and fled the courtroom. She burst through the double doors and straight into a blinding, chaotic flash of press cameras. The mistress who had so cruelly mocked the wife in the lobby was now nothing more than collateral damage in a federal fraud investigation, her reputation permanently destroyed. Clara slowly turned her attention back to the defense table. Richard finally looked up at her. He looked 20 years older than he had that morning. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale and drawn. "Clara!" Richard croaked, fresh tears welling in his red-rimmed eyes. He stood up, taking a hesitant step towards the center aisle. "Clara, please, think about what you're doing. We ate ramen noodles in that freezing apartment in Bellevue. We stayed up all night tracing code. I built this company from nothing. It is my life's work. You can't just take it all away over a mistake. We can fix this. We can fire the lawyers, sit down, and renegotiate the settlement privately." Clara closed the distance between them, stopping just a few feet away. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had willingly starved alongside, the man who had tossed her aside like garbage the exact second his ego outgrew their marriage vows. "You built the product, Richard." "That much is true," Clara said, her voice devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. "But I built the foundation. I built the legal structure. I secured the financing. And I kept the lights on when you were ready to quit. You forgot the cardinal rule of architecture. If you try to demolish the foundation, the entire house, team, falls directly on your head." Richard reached a trembling hand out toward her. "I'm your husband." "You were my husband," Clara corrected sharply, stepping back out of his reach. "Right up until you decided to funnel $380 million to the Cayman Islands to ensure I walked away with pennies. You offered me $2 million and told me to keep my dignity. I decided I'd rather keep my company." Before Richard could formulate another pathetic plea, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. A tall, impeccably dressed man with silver hair and a tailored navy suit walked in, flanked by two serious-looking corporate attorneys carrying thick briefcases. It was William Bradley, the ruthless and highly respected CEO of Oakmont Capital Partners. He had been quietly sitting in the courthouse's overflow room all morning, watching the entire disastrous trial unfold via closed-circuit television. Richard's eyes widened. A desperate, delusional spark of hope ignited in his chest. "Bill!" Richard gasped, stumbling forward. "Bill, thank God you're here. Listen, this is all a massive legal misunderstanding. It's a temporary injunction. I can have the offshore trusts unwound by Friday, and we can proceed with the merger exactly as planned." William Bradley didn't even break his stride. He walked right past Richard as if the man were completely invisible, not offering a handshake, a nod, or even a glance. Bradley stopped directly in front of Clara and extended a firm, respectful hand. "Mrs. Sterling," Bradley said, his deep voice echoing in the quiet room, carrying a look of profound respect. "My legal team and I have been watching the proceedings very closely. I will be blunt. Oakmont Capital Partners has absolutely zero interest in acquiring a tech firm managed by a CEO who is currently facing imminent federal indictments for wire fraud and perjury. We have a strict morality clause, and Richard has just become a massive liability." Behind them, Richard let out a hollow, devastated groan, collapsing back into his chair. The merger, his billion-dollar legacy, was officially dead. "However," Bradley continued, a sharp, shark-like smile forming on his lips as he looked at Clara, "Oakmont is incredibly interested in partnering with a majority shareholder who possesses the tactical brilliance, the flawless financial acumen, and the sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness that you demonstrated in this room today. When the dust settles on this legal mess and the federal authorities clear the corporate accounts, I would like to personally invite you to our headquarters in San Francisco." Bradley handed Clara a heavy embossed business card. "I believe Sterling Data Solutions, under your direct leadership and operational control, has a very bright, highly profitable future." Clara took the card, returning his sharp smile with one of her own. "I will have my transition team set up a meeting for next week, Mr. Bradley. We have a significant amount of executive restructuring to discuss." "I look forward to it, Madam CEO," Bradley nodded respectfully, before turning and leading his lawyers out of the room. Clara picked up her black notebook and her coat from the plaintiff's table. She didn't look back at Richard again. She didn't need to. He was already a ghost, a cautionary tale, a relic of a past she was leaving firmly in the rear-view mirror. Clara Sterling walked down the center aisle, her heels clicking against the wood with the steady, authoritative, unstoppable rhythm of a woman who had just conquered an empire. She pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out of the shadows of the courtroom and directly into the blinding, brilliant flash of the cameras, ready to take her rightful place at the absolute top. Clara's story is a chilling reminder that true power rarely shouts from the rooftops. It usually operates quietly in the background, holding all the receipts. Richard and Chloe thought they could manipulate the system and discard a loyal partner like a broken toy, blinded by arrogance and greed. But they drastically underestimated the quiet strength and strategic brilliance of a woman scorned. Clara didn't just survive her husband's betrayal. She dismantled his entire reality, proving that the person who builds the foundation always holds the keys to the castle. If this incredible story of betrayal, ultimate karma, and a fiercely intelligent woman taking back her empire had your heart racing, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping, real-life drama stories. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.